Eric, do you know what I love to have for breakfast?
A big old bowl of J.O.'s. I just imagine you have a box of cereal with your face on it.
I was going to say reviews on Apple Podcasts. They give me more sustenance than anything else in my life. They bring me energy. They get me ready for the day ahead. And you know, Eric, it's been a minute since I had a good bowl of reviews on Apple Podcasts.
Sometimes I read my reviews right before I go to bed, just so I can dream good dreams at night.
If you want to help me start the day right and help my self-esteem while also helping us in the eyes of Apple, please leave a review for Upside on Apple Podcasts. If you have an iPhone, even if you don't use Apple Podcasts, we would love for you to submit a review about why you love Upside. And if you don't have an iPhone, if you're an Android user, that's okay too.
A year ago, right before lockdown, we moved into this 5,000 square foot warehouse. And I was like, oh, this is where it's going to happen. And then we spent a year not being in that warehouse. And it started picking up again in the fall. And again, we're bootstrapped, right? So like we couldn't like call our investors and be like, send more cash. We just had to like piece our way through it. And now it's full. It's full to the gills of different hardware projects we're doing.
The startup investment landscape is changing, and world-class companies are being built outside of Silicon Valley. We find them, talk with them, and discuss the upside of investing in them. Welcome to Upside.
Woo! Hello, and welcome to the Upside Podcast, the first podcast finding upside outside of Silicon Valley. I'm Eric Hornung, and I'm accompanied by my co-host, Mr. New Studio Setup himself, Jay Klaus. Jay, how's it going, man?
So good. We will post on Twitter today a side-by-side comparison, a little how it started, how it's going of the new home studio, because I am pumped to be moved in and have my recording equipment here, no longer going between apartment to house to record. I love it. When we first visited this place, Mallory looked down here and said, this is going to be awesome. And I said, I don't know about all that. And now it is.
I'm so shocked that I'm the one on the other side of the mics right now, because I saw a picture and it looked like maybe your cat was going to take over for me.
Yes. So the struggle with the cat in the old home office was that he would jump up from the side of the desk and bug me. And now my desk is actually kind of out in the middle of the room. So he has all four sides of the desk that he can jump on top of it. And he is taking full advantage this morning, literally interrupting my recording by just shoving his face into the microphone. So we'll have to get some control on that. We have a literal cat door that's been cut into the door above the basement, and we didn't cut that. And we're trying to decide if we want to cover it. It's nice because like he can fit his giant body under it and come down here and visit whenever he wants. But it's also bad because he can fit his big giant body under it and come down to visit whenever he wants.
When you were launching this podcast studio, this new podcast studio in your basement, did you think through all these variables like
absolutely
Baloo can come in and out?
Absolutely.
Or where's my microphone going to go? Or did you consult with someone, or you just said, here, I have the vision?
We literally debated for several days on whether we wanted to take the door off of the bedroom and replace it with the door to the basement, because the door in the bedroom does not have a cat door cut into it. But then that interrupts our sleep. So it's like, what do we value more, our sleep or our recording integrity? I pushed for the recording integrity, but Mallory values sleep a little bit more.
That's understandable. I think that the recording integrity would indirectly suffer if Mallory and you weren't sleeping well.
Yeah, and you know, I don't want to, this is Baloo's house too, and I don't want to interrupt him living his best life.
And you know, Baloo only has one life. Well, actually, Baloo's a cat, so Baloo has 9 lives to live. But if Baloo were a human and had only one life to live, we would recommend that Baloo go check out our friends at Ethos Wealth Management, who are helping you live the one life you have the best way possible. You can go to upside.fm/ethos to learn more.
Other than that, the actual like AV setup, pretty easy to do. I'll improve it over time, but it's not exactly rocket science.
You know, it is rocket science, Jay.
What's that?
Our guest today.
Building actual rockets and launch sites. That's right. Today's guest is Ben Kellie, the founder and CEO of The Launch Company. Ben has a degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, as well as a master's in mechanical engineering from the Ohio State University, where I met him. And before he returned to Alaska, which is where he lives now and runs his business, he worked at SpaceX, designing and operating launch sites. He even ran the first missions to return a first stage rocket from orbit. Crazy stuff, Eric. Literal rocket science.
Outside of the fact that I am so stoked for this conversation, it's going to be great to talk about the next frontier, which is space, but we're also getting to talk to a new frontier for us, which is Alaska. We haven't been to Alaska, Jay. We haven't talked about the startup ecosystem there, and it's more and more rare that you and I get to see somewhere new for the first time on the show.
Totally. The launch company is building the world's first multi-user mobile launch site for this planet and beyond by developing standardized hardware, ground support equipment, and processes. Ben's company was founded in 2015, based in Anchorage, Alaska, and Eric, he is bootstrapped.
You love to see a good bootstrap founder. I think there's also some news on the capital side for the launch company, so look forward to getting into that in this interview as well.
That's right. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode. You can tweet at us at UpsideFM or email us hello@upside.fm. And we'll get in that interview with Ben right after this. This episode is sponsored by Fundboard. Fundboard is a free tool to help you find startup investors and manage your fundraising process. Fundboard helps you to find not just the right firm, but the right person at the right firm. Fundboard makes it easy to search, save, and share. You can search thousands of investors ranked by how well they match your startup. You can save them to your Fundboard to create your list of targeted investors, and you can share your Fundboard with your network to game plan how you'll approach investors directly. You can build a tailor-fit list of startup investors in minutes with Fundboard, and you can learn more at upside.fm/fundboard. That's upside.fm/fundboard, and the link is in the show notes.
Ben, I want to start with a question that we don't usually start with here on Upside. We only do it when it's a little bit, when someone has a little bit longer of a career. You know, we're talking to a more seasoned individual, but the pun is just too good. Can you take me through a rocket ship of your career?
Wow. Thank you, Eric. I appreciate that.
I thought he wasn't going to ask at first. I'm like, this is the most obvious starting point.
Okay. Well, you know, I will say I'm 34. I've been in the industry, I guess, 8 years now, and not even quite. In June, it'll be 8 years. We always joke that like the experiences we had at SpaceX seasoned us. A decade was a year, or a year was a decade, in other ways. And I think that was largely true. So yeah, my background, I grew up in Alaska. My dad was a bush pilot, and we had a business where we flew groceries to communities off the grid in Western Alaska. It was really cool. And it just kind of imbued me with this like problem solving mindset, being hands-on, being in the field, and just like creating things. And I went to Ohio State for grad school and came out and got a job at SpaceX in California as a responsible engineer for some fluid systems on a pad. And that was in Vandenberg Air Force Base. And it was going to be like their West Coast launch pad. I guess it still is. It was really funny because the sign as you came up to it said like SLIC, which is South Launch Complex, 4 East, launch and landing pad. And everybody was like, oh gosh, you know, how cool. But of course, the ULA people, United Launch Alliance guys down the street would roll their eyes. They thought it was so dumb. And, you know, because it was all a fantasy then, none of that existed. And so I spent about 18 months working my way through the design and build of that site. I was one of 8 pad engineers who all had a fluid system. And what was cool, it was like a dream job in that we would sit down, we would design it, we'd do the math, lay it all out. And then we'd go outside with the technicians and the welders and the electricians and we'd build it. And then a really curious thing happened one day, which is a rocket showed up on a giant trailer and went into the hangar. And we were like, oh, things are getting real, because it's just been a construction site, right? And it's like, this is like transforming before our eyes and becoming a launch pad. And I'll never forget the day that everybody left. You know, like, I don't know if you've been on a construction site, or just imagine a very busy place where everybody's buzzing around like bees and all of a sudden everybody's gone. I mean, there's like 80 people, up to 80 people would be out there and everybody's gone. And my boss, I had become lead engineer for the launch, and my boss came up to me and shook my hand and was like, you're a pad. And he like got in a car and drove to the control room because he was going to be launch conductor. So I'm just standing there with my arms on my hands on my hips. I think I'd been out of grad school for 14 months. And, you know, I had to like operate this pad. And so we were in charge of rolling the rocket, getting it set up, making all the connections, getting everything ready. And then I ran a little team called Red Team that would come back to the pad in a minivan if there was a problem with the rocket that we had to fix. And we did come back a couple of times. So that 14-month span was insanity. I regularly worked 17 hours a day, 7 days a week. but I learned a ton, and I got to do all the stuff I loved doing as a kid growing up as a bush pilot in Alaska. Like I was in the dirt, putting things together, solving really challenging, thermofluid problems, and then making it all come together for this launch. And something I discovered that I didn't realize I loved, but it makes sense, is like operations. So like, how do the people and parts and paper all come together to actually, make this chunk of aluminum go to space? And wrote a lot of the procedures, ran a lot of the procedures with the team. And it was I've got great memories from it. Like people who like 1 week before were like electricians or welders or like painters and sweepers. It's like, you're a launch tech now. And they're like, okay, and give them an iPad and a headset. And so like you're walking around with these guys with names like, Muffy and, pork chop or things like that. And like, there's like checking valves and stuff. And so it's just like this very homegrown, like cool thing that happened. After that, I summarily quit because they were like, well, we're not going to do any more launches off this pad for like 18 months. You guys are going to write government procedures. And I was like, not me. And so I don't know why, I just quit. And I moved to Seattle. I was going to do a hardware startup that Jay was familiar with the concept of. It was this like thermoelectric charger. And I was there 6 weeks. And this guy called me. He was a buddy of mine from Vandy. And he's like, hey, I'm in town. Let me buy you dinner. We bought dinner. And he's like, hey, we're going to build this barge. We're going to put it in the middle ocean. We're going to try to land on it. And I was like, oh, dope. And he's like, we need some help. Could you come out for like 8 weeks and just like do your field general thing, like push the guys along, get everything put together. And I was like, yeah, that'd be super dope. Like turned into 9-10 months of just building and blowing up barges and living in a hotel in Louisiana. We built it an hour outside of New Orleans in a place called Morgan City on the Atchafalaya. And then I actually rode it. I rode in the tugboat as we drug it through the Gulf and around and set it up in Jacksonville, Florida, and took all the first missions out of there. And it was crazy. It was super fun. And I think it took us, September to, I guess it was 4 or 5 months to build it the first time. And it was a very small team. I think it was like 5 of us really on it. And then we got to Jacksonville and had to finish it out. And the first time after we blew it up, we rebuilt it in like 4 weeks. And then the second time we got destroyed in the big storm on the ocean, we built it in like 3 days. It was just crazy. And so we got really, really good at it. And I realized that I just loved building hard things, like solving sticky problems. And I love being hands-on with it and working with the team to get it done. So that entire period I just described to you was 24 months.
Talk about a rocket ship.
Yeah. So you wanted the rocket ship. I know it was a long answer to a short question, but that was the rocket ship. And then from there, I decided I didn't want to live in a hotel in Florida anymore. I was offered full-time work, but I really missed Alaska. And I left. So I left again. I spent 2 weeks in Scotland with my family, finding myself or thinking about what I was going to do with my life. And I just moved to Alaska. I love it here. I love being connected to nature and being out in the woods and wilderness. I'm a pilot. I love to fly. I love to boat, hike. And again, 6 weeks later, SpaceX called, and now I'm consulting for them. And that's how the launch company started. It was called K2 Dronautics at the time. We were doing drone services, but that didn't really pan out. And being a business genius, I was like, well, people are paying us to help solve rocket problems. Maybe we should just do that. So anyway, that's how LaunchCo started.
Before we dive into the launch company, you were talking about a launch pad, and I kind of realized that I have no idea what a launch pad is. My brain immediately went to like a helicopter pad, just a piece of concrete. And then I was like, oh no, I've seen some NASA things where they have like a big stanchion. So how much of like a launch pad is physical things being built? Whereas like a rocket is like all these little intricate things. You see all these little instruments, all these things being built. How much of a launch pad is things being built versus processes being built and done?
The answer is it depends. It depends on the rocket. So legacy stuff, yeah, you'd have these giant towers out there. You would do what's called vertical integration, where you stack these sections of the rocket and it's all vertical and rolls out, like the shuttle did this. Saturn V did this. SpaceX does what's called horizontal integration. So they put the rings together lying down and then they roll it out and stand it up. And so some of our clients that we work with day to day are launching microsatellites. And so they really do have pretty much a flat concrete pad. And then what we do is we help them design modules that roll out on trucks and service the rocket for launch. And so it's really kind of a wide gamut of things. If you're talking about a vehicle the size of Falcon 9, it's mostly hardware. But what powers that hardware, and it's all fixed, it's thousands and thousands of gallons of propellant. What powers that though is that process. And so It's probably the classic 80-20 rule where, there's a lot of equipment out there, but what you're not seeing is all of that detail work that actually makes it useful, make sure everything arrives in the right place at the right time, at the right temperature and pressure to animate it.
When it was the first time you guys were doing this back in like 2012,
Yeah.
and you guys are building this pad, and it's the first privatized space flight project, right? At the time,
they had the operation on the Cape. So they had been flying off of LC-40 at the Cape, but would be the first polar pad and the first one on Vandenberg. Yeah.
How did you guys get your arms around what the hell you were doing there?
Well, I can't speak for everybody else. For me, it was just living it and breathing it. I mean, it sounds crazy, but essentially it's a game of interfaces. So I think this is where like some software, any general project management person could understand. It's like, well, something's going to come in and then something has to go out. So like, let's control that interface and define the hell out of that. And we'll make the spaghetti in the middle. We'll mix everything together. And what was great was I remember in my interview, there was a lot of things where I was like, well, I don't know, but here's what I think. Or, hey, I don't know that fact, but here's how I'll find out. And I was told later that was kind of like key because they're like, dude, we're asking you stuff like no human being would possibly know the answer to every single one of these things, right? And if you did, we wouldn't trust you, right? They're like, we're more interested. We're doing things that haven't been done. And I give talks on this to STEM programs where it's like, there was not a job for me to train for in undergrad or in grad school at Ohio State that said like rocket landing guy or launching person, right? It was mechanical engineering. And so what you're doing is you're building a toolbox. And so you just rely on that toolbox and you say, well, it's just math and they need this temperature, this pressure, this flow rate, whatever. And you back calculate it. And I think for me, a lot of the issue was like, what was hard to get my head around was like the interface with the rocket and the actual operations, because that side of it was really well defined. Like they're like, hey, we've been launching these things out of LC-40. We know what we want to do. We know, everything, every commodity we call them, every gas and fuel and propellant piece. And that was the hard part to get my head wrapped around. And it was really just like going to Texas to the test site, seeing what's called a mission duty cycle. I was up on the second stage test stand, not that far away from this rocket that's just like full thrust for 180 seconds. And then being in the data room, looking at all that and being like, oh, like this is how this works, like just piecing it together. And everybody is very collaborative, right? Because we're all very cognizant of the fact that we have no idea what we're doing. And so it's about not knowing, but being super, super interested in finding out in a non-theoretical way. Not like, oh, I'm curious about that. Can I Google it? It's like, I'm curious about that. I'm going to go outside and figure it out.
Well, let me compare this to a recent experience of mine that I think is similar. We wanted to put up and create what is called a board and batten wall in our new bedroom, where we have like the whole wall and you got to put boards across the top, the bottom, the sides, and you make a grid pattern out of it.
We're doing this in the nursery. I'm with you.
Okay. And so we wanted these squares to be the same size, but I had a slight miscalculation on both the width and the height. And then I rounded these things to be equal. I'm like, okay, 19 and a half is close enough. We put the boards up and we see, oh, actually those things that I rounded resulted in a couple of these squares being bigger than the others. Smaller stakes, comparatively speaking, but how like important is the math that you're doing out here on this launching pad for these things that you're doing?
Yeah, I'm a big fan. On the pad, we had more time and things were a little more understood. I mean, it's funny to say you have more time when it's like a 14-month launch from nothing to something. But on the barge, I was a lot more about these like 10% things. So it's like, hey, we don't know what the problem is going to be. Like, what is the complicating thing actually going to be, right? Is it going to be, if I put 10 more days into making this air delivery system perfect, is that the thing? No, probably not. And so it was about triaging things as fast as we can. I used to always say to people, like, do not fall in love with a problem because there are plenty more. Like, and so the answer is that, like, kind of my thing that I would do is I spent so much time on the launch pad doing the math, learning it, and then trying to spend time to like actually file that away such that it becomes, you get a feel for it. You get a feel of like, so it was like, hey, I'm going to run this, schedule 120 pipe over here. I'm going to make it 2 inches. You're like, you can make that 2 inch? I don't know. Like, that doesn't feel right, because what I've seen in the past is this would need to be maybe a 4-inch pipe, or, hey, I'm going to do 1/4 inch tubing to all this. No. And so you can do less of the math. Now we'll go back and check it to make sure it's right, but you can get to the point where you're doing So in your case, like instead of spending all the time to do the perfect math and then realizing like, oh, well, the boards I forgot to account for the actual width of the board. So I was going to the edge and it compounded out as this error. I would just put the boards on the wall and be like, oh, cool. Looks like I can get these about here, and then measure and be like, well, this one's 17 and a half and this one's 18. Okay. It's probably 17 and 3/4, and so it's about that, like failing quickly up front when the stakes are low, instead of like, not to pick on your situation, but like buying materials, cutting all the boards based on some math we did, and then putting it up and be like, well, son of a gun. No, this is right. And so that's kind of what we did. And we would do this math, but if it passed the look right test, we just had to keep going. And it, a lot of those barges blew up anyway. So it was, nobody was there to see our mistakes.
On the things that require precision, how much of it is like immediately measured with sensors? And then is there like a software interface that you guys use to see? I'm assuming there are so many numbers being spit at you all the time. Is there a standard, like in the launch industry space, is there some sort of interface that people use?
Yeah. So in my day at SpaceX, everything was coming back, and we were, I won't tell you specifically what we were using. It's probably not good, but I will tell you that it is very well known and it was not built for this application. And so it was just big on cobbling things together. And now, I'm sure that they've upgraded and changed a lot of that. But yeah, you have thousands of channels of data coming back. And then it's no good just to have these data streams come in. It's like, hey, what does it mean? So we've written programs that take those data values, and either it's a gate where it's like, hey, this pressure is critical and it fell below, or it's like, hey, this pressure, this flow rate, and this temperature are all nominal. And so we're doing calculations and math on that data that comes in to tell us like, hey, here's the overall state and health of the system. And we plot those in real time, and we set alarms, because it's impossible to look at like thousands of lines coming in. And so we set alarms around them, and those are gating criteria. When we do the math, I should say, like, you always put a margin on it, right? And so then in the case of fluids, we can throttle it down. Think about like your garden hose or your kitchen faucet. You're like, well, it's going a little too fast. You can throttle it down. Or we'll put an orifice in or a regulator for a gas. And that's how we can kind of fine tune at the end, because, you're never really to do all the analysis to get it exactly at that point. It's like, well, we just wasted 6 months like doing this super high end analysis, and because the tube has one more bend than we thought it would have. It's like, well, that's not useful. So there's a middle ground.
One more question on the general kind of space, as you called it earlier.
Yeah.
Who's the closest person to a rocket when it takes off?
It would probably be, well, if you're on a U.S. Air Force installation, it would be the U.S. Air Force and like their range trackers with some of the range tracking band, and then second place, who's just about as close as your lead engineer and red team. So in my case, like we were with the fire department, we're in fire suits, and we're like right on what's called the quantity distance or QD line, which is this mathematically calculated, like if this thing blows up in range shrapnel, you're outside that line. For Falcon 9, it was about 2 miles, but it feels a lot closer when 1.1 million pounds of thrust is going off, and it's cool. You can feel it in your chest. Everything's rumbling. You're standing there in your firefighter gear, which I had no training. It's like they're like, put on these fireproof pants. I was like, okay, that was my training. And then you like rush back to site and you're putting out fires and stuff. So yeah, that's a really good question. There are some weird old stories of people who like hid on launch sites in dumpsters and stuff and like died from the acoustics.
Wow.
So yeah, you don't want to be much closer, I think, than that.
Wow. Okay. Well, to kind of transition us into the launch company here in a minute, help me understand the state of the space as compared to like 10 years ago, because we went for forever with it being NASA, and that was pretty much all that was happening. How have things changed over the last decade or so?
Yeah. So SpaceX was founded in like 2002. So, yeah. And a lot of those early years, Elon was, not a lot of the early years, but for a period, Elon was trying to like procure an ICBM from Russia. And, like that was part of the plan. And then they built Falcon 1, and I was not a part of Falcon 1. I came in, right at about flight 2 or 3 of Falcon 9. So after that, but a lot of my buddies there were, and it's one of those things where when NASA and, the Soviet Union were essentially in this race, everything had to be done, and it had to be what's called vertically integrated. Like Every single thing you're going to decide is done in-house. SpaceX privatized that. And you got to keep in mind that ULA, which is United Launch Alliance, is the coming together of the two previous dominant players in the space. And essentially they had, they were private and commercial, but they had a monopoly on the market. So SpaceX came in and said, well, we see your $300 million launch. We'll do it for $65 million. And that price difference is just too great not to take them seriously. Because you got to understand, everybody's very risk averse. Well, yeah, but these guys can guarantee it'll get done. And so it's been interesting to see that change. What we're seeing now that SpaceX has had a lot of success is all these other companies proliferating into that area. And in my view, and why we started the launch company is because I think that there's a chance to solve different parts of the value chain and not necessarily have to recreate the wheel every time. I like to joke that if everybody's out there recreating the wheel, a lot of them are going to come out octagonal, and then they're going to spend $10 million trying to build a suspension system to eat up the bumps. And we could just help you have a round wheel from day one. And so that's kind of how we started. And I believe, there's this joke that in history, every great, economic evolution is either an unbundling or a rebundling of services. And we're just going through time rebundling and unbundling. But we're trying to say hey, y'all are super, super good at building engines, building rockets, but launch doesn't have to be your core competency. If the three of us, you've got these great podcast microphones. If the three of us were put 10 years of experience into building these badass, microphones, and we put millions of dollars into the design and the field and market research, blah, blah, blah. And then we went down to the port and we're finally ready to ship them. Well, you got to build the boat too. They're we don't build boats. And that's what we're finding with launch is they're oh, we built this dope rocket, roll it outside and light the end. And it's whoa, that's not how this works. So I think that if you want to talk about creating an actual business case for space, that there's a chance for a lot of these small to medium rockets to have standardization. And that's where we come in. So that's kind of the history. It went from government full stack to private full stack. And now we're seeing people start to open up that value chain and say, hey, we're going to be good at this one piece. And that's where real cost savings, I think, will come from.
What is the growing incentive for a proliferation of people trying to go to space? What are people trying to privately go to space for?
Yeah. So a number of things. We would say in the small to medium launch range, it's almost always some constellation reseeding. So either for communications, there's some dedicated satellite companies that are trying to do Internet of Things from space, where you can keep track of machinery and equipment and people. There's also a lot of science packages. So the same way that, our cell phones are more powerful than computers of old, the science packages that go into satellites can go into what's called a CubeSat, 10 centimeters cube on each side. And that's one unit. And some of them are 1 unit or 3 unit or 6 unit big. And they'll go to a sun synchronous orbit, meaning they're always in sync with the sun. And so they can image the Earth and just slowly swoop around. So if you're flying a polar orbit and Earth is turning beneath you, you're seeing a new part of the globe as it turns beneath you. And you always have the light of the sun for your imaging. And so we're seeing a lot of those things happen. There's satellites that are tracking sea level rise, deforestation. We're actually seeing a lot of this imaging and data is super interesting to hedge funds because they're doing futures and looking into different financial things. So there's all these different applications. And we're seeing too that as access to space opens up, demand is further increasing. So we're not there yet, I think, for the amount of science and things people would want to do if the price was right to get there.
So with the internet, you can put as much stuff on it as you want. Everybody who wants to add something, you just add more stuff. It's not like there's a hypothetical or physical limitation on it, but space is very much like a physical place, even though it doesn't feel like it to us. So how much stuff can we put up there?
Okay, so there is a physical cost when you put something on the internet, right? There's a server somewhere. And so there is some theoretical limit, if all the land and sea mass were, I'm not trying to be pedantic, I'm just trying to make a point overall that it's the same in space. That limit is smaller. And certainly already with Starlink, you're seeing astronomers say, hey, this is impacting our science and our ability. I think the easy answer is that you have to have anything that goes up needs to have a deorbit plan of how's it going to come back down? And that's different. That's something that's evolving. We're all trying to learn and there's not been this much demand before. To actually choke the sky would take an insane amount of objects. And I don't think, we're not close to that point right now. But tracking is becoming something that say like AFWorks, which is the innovation arm of the Air Force, is putting a lot of money and time into and is super interested in, as well as like orbital debris mitigation. And so, man, we're always seeing like SBIRs, Small Business Innovation Research grants, going to people that are trying to do orbit decluttering. And the only path forward is that as things go up, they have to have a plan to come back down. I could look into it. I don't know off the top of my head, but it's going to take a lot to actually fully saturate and choke the sky.
There's a theory called the Kessler effect that says that as more and more stuff goes up into space, the likelihood of a collision between two things increases exponentially, and that would cause more collisions. So I was just curious, like, if we are anywhere close to there, and if what you're doing with standardizing launch and making launch easier as we have more and more rocket companies sending stuff up into space is going to accelerate the clutter in space. But it sounds like there's an industry norm to have a orbital path of some sort.
Well, we're working towards that norm. I don't think it's there, but yeah, it's a very real concern. The problem is that there's certain, it's not like a mean free path problem where like if you're talking about like gas molecules in a room and was the mean free path as you increase the number of molecules, because everybody wants to be in these specific orbital bands, right? And so it's like, oh, I want to be in Leo, I want to be Geo, I want to be SynSync. And so it's not just like we can be a cloud of electron around the Earth. You want to be like in these specific bands. And so that's what makes it a little more limited and restricted. And the other challenge we're having is that as we get more access to space, people are disrupting things in the Silicon Valley mindset and maybe not, being good house guests all the time. And so, yeah, we just are going to see more things getting locked down and more rules have to be put in place, I think. But I think it is preventable. And I think we can serve all the needs that everybody has without that becoming an issue.
You talked earlier about creating this round wheel for everybody. Tactically, how does that look? Is that a consulting service where you pop in and say, here's how we're going to do it? Is it we literally build launch pads? Like, how are you guys making money?
Yeah, great question. So we are a fully bootstrapped company, and it started out as Turn the Crank Consulting. Absolutely. And that was purposeful because, we have kids to feed, but also because it's a great way to learn. And so we're doing market research and talking and building relationships and being like, what are your real problems? What are you really running into? And then we're solving that for them. And we're like, oh, this is neat. And so if, we can solve something for one person, we go solve it for everybody type thing. And so we can, obviously we're not violating any IP. If there's a specific solution for somebody, we keep that in-house. But if there's a more generalized solution that we can spin off at our own cost and development, then we try to do that. So a great example is like our hardware line. The first piece we had is quick disconnects, which are fueling connectors between the rocket and the ground. And when the rocket takes off, they disconnect and snap shut. And that keeps all the fuel from draining right back out the line. And so we ran into the problem where our clients were like, oh, we can't find any quick disconnects anywhere. Old school aerospace companies will sell them to us, but they want $100,000 in what's called NRE, non-recoverable engineering costs. And then they want 6 months to deliver us a prototype. Then they want to do a review. And it's like, dude, we're like 12 months into an 18-month VC cycle. Like we need something now. And, again, I made a joke earlier about being a business genius. I had another one of those moments where I was like, well, we should just build those. And they're like, okay. And so we did. And we built them for a company. They launched. They did good. And another company called us and they were like mad. They're like, hey, you built QDs for so-and-so? I was like, yeah, we did. They're like, oh, well, we need QDs. I was like, great. And they're like, well, would you sell them to us? I was like, yeah. And so anyway, that's how it happened. And so we're finding like also that there's a bunch of like homebrew solutions in these companies, and we can just be like, hey, it doesn't have to be that way. There's an uphill battle we're fighting because so many of the old school supply chain companies for aerospace are like, well, that's $1 million because it goes on a rocket. And we're like, okay, cool. Well, this is 10 grand and you understand that it has to be qualified and you're putting it through the test and everything needs to be done. They're like, yeah, totally. Great. So that's kind of what I would say is the next evolution for us. Those parts have been selected for some really cool stuff that I was hoping to be able to announce by now, but can't. But keep your eyes on the news. I'm really excited about some of the places these will go. And so anyway, it's going to be cool. We're growing, we're moving it out. So they've been selected to do on-orbit refueling, which is like a big deal of like servicing satellites. So they'll demonstrate that either late this year or early next year. They'll go up on, I think it's an Electron or Rocket Lab launch. our fittings will be used to transfer a fuel fluid in space, come back down, and then that'll give us a pathway towards that. There's a couple other really cool hardware projects off planet that we're working on. And then the next evolution was building modules. And so at SpaceX on the barge, we built everything in shipping containers, and we just kind of kept that up. They're cheap. They're easy. When you want to send them somewhere, there's never any questions. It's just like, oh yeah, shipping container. Super easy to move through the world of logistics. And so we just shipped, we've got a few. We've got a 40-foot shipping container that we're turning into a mobile fueling module for F-22 fighter jets for the Air Force. Another 20-foot one for some other mobile fueling for the Air Force. And then we just shipped out a 10-foot container for one of our clients that is essentially serving as a dummy second stage. So we outfitted it to work just like the second stage of their rocket. So when they test their test site, they can check it all out on this thing and make sure it all works right before they hook it up to a real rocket. So we're building bigger and bigger stuff all the time. And then the next version of that is to build mobile launch site modules for rocket companies.
Does this ever feel daunting to you? Like, it feels like everything you're saying to me is so much bigger than anything I've ever done or even thought about doing on both a technical level, but also you just said the word, I think, out of planet or something. Like,
oh yeah, off planet.
Off planet. Do you ever feel like, oh wow, this is big? I
do, but in an excited way. And I think what grounds us is that it's the same math and science. Like it's still physics. We're still in this dimension. And so we have known tools that we can rely on, to push it forward. A year ago, right before lockdown, we moved into this 5,000 square foot warehouse. And I was like, oh, this is where it's going to happen. And then we spent a year not being in that warehouse. And it started picking up again in the fall. And again, we're bootstrapped, right? So we couldn't call our investors and be like, send more cash. We just had to piece our way through it. And now it's full. It's full to the gills of different hardware projects we're doing. And I'm already thinking about well, can we move somewhere else? Can we grow somewhere bigger? And so those are the parts that I think are daunting, but in a good way. And there was a lot of days at SpaceX where it was daunting. I had some really, really hard days there where it's okay, I know today's going to suck. The second you wake up, you're like, this is that day and I've got to get through it. And maybe I only slept 3 hours the night before. And I think here, I just feel like the hardest day, I try to keep things in perspective. I had a super hard day yesterday, actually, totally unrelated. I won't tell the story, but some stuff happened that I was just like, oh man, it derailed my whole day. And I always say the worst day here is still an awesome day because I'm living in Alaska. I have a great family and I'm literally doing the thing that I set out to do. So it's whenever I'm really trying to spiral or get down, I always just tell myself well, this is what you asked for. And I'm yeah, it is what I asked for. This is dope. And so, yeah, I don't think it daunts us on the technical side because of the math, but on the other side, we're just living the dream.
I hear you talking about some of these transactions, and it doesn't sound all that different than what I would expect, a local mechanic looking for parts, or even a coffee shop that needs the cardboard slips on their cups. It sounds hey, you have the thing we need, we're going to buy it. It doesn't sound like you're going through these crazy sales cycles. So I want you to tell me if I am hearing you incorrectly, how much red tape is there in these transactions, or is it just a more expensive product in the same type of transaction?
It spans an entirely humongous gamut, right? So I just got off the phone. The reason I was running a little bit late to this is I just got off the phone with a guy who called me. They're in a panic. They need high six figures of work to start next week. And that was a phone call. And I'm like, great. That's an awesome phone call. Thank you for calling me. I have also gone through RFP processes. Obviously, I'm not going to say who, but we put in an RFP to a client in October. And they're still deciding if they're going to do it or not. And whoever they pick, they still want to hold the original schedule, which is rapidly shrinking. And so that is a big red tape process. For this off-planet stuff we're talking about, that's a whole other project. Insane amount of red tape. I think we've been talking to them for 2 years, close to it, at least a year and a half. And it's coming to fruition. That's just how it goes. I think with the new space customers, we have a good reputation, and a lot of them are people I worked with previously at SpaceX. It's a very small industry. It takes forever to build their reputation and a second to kill it. And so that's where those phone calls can happen. Be cool, dude, just do the work. With some of the ones that don't know us as well, or maybe are a little older school, that's where the red tape comes in. So yeah, we don't have a defined sales process. It can be really challenging.
Is there a SpaceX mafia kind of forming? Is there out of all of the new space companies, the rocket companies, are most of them coming from SpaceX and Blue Origin, or just SpaceX, or
I think on the rocket side, mostly yes. A lot of the talent came from SpaceX or Blue Origin or whatever. Like Relativity Space was founded by Tim Ellis. I've done a lot of work for them. He's a great guy. He spent time at Blue. So like they're seeding those things. Tom Marcusic, who runs Firefly, spent time at SpaceX in Virgin Orbit, or maybe it's Galactic, but I think it was Orbit. So the point is like, yeah, it's a small community. Everybody knows each other. I don't know if there's like a SpaceX mafia as much. There is a joke that I have an inside joke with like these people that I worked with at SpaceX for a long time who've now gone on to other companies. There was like 5 of us, and I laugh. I'm like, after 6 years, we still only call it, like there was 6,000 people in this company, and we would call each other and be like, hey, can you solve this? And even though we're at different companies now, that's still there. And we have a name. We have a name for that group that, it's probably not appropriate to say on air, but is a fun little group, and we all stay really tight. So I think that is forming. On the spacecraft side, I don't think as much. I think a lot of that's coming out of research labs, and they're seeded through like SBIRs and NASA innovation grants and things like that.
Do you feel like the amount of innovation and capital pouring into space is accelerating right now, or is it just growing? Dude,
it's SPAC City. It's wild right now. Like everybody and their brother and sister and second cousin twice removed. And it started in electric cars. We saw the Nikola thing happen, but then you see like Lordstown and all these other ones. And we're seeing it now in space. Momentus, Astra, a handful of others, Spire, are all SPACing. And the amount of capital is crazy. It's really crazy. Everybody wants to be a part of the next SpaceX and have got in. My original share price has gone up. Obviously can't say the exact number, but it went on the order of magnitude from say 10 to many hundreds in value per share. Right. And so it's just crazy. Everybody was trying to jump into that and have a piece of that.
You mentioned that Launch Company has been totally bootstrapped. With all this funding that's accelerating into the space, did you look at taking investment?
We did. We have looked at taking investment in a number of different ways over the years. And actually, we are in the process of being acquired, but a majority acquisition from Voyager Space Holdings, which I'm pumped about and I'll talk about in a second. But at that time, we had 3, and I'll call it 3.5 offers on the table to get acquired, do the Voyager buyout, or raise VC. And ultimately, the Voyager thing made a lot of sense to me because, I think we're going to create value in the VC realm, of what would be attractive to them. But what I didn't like as much was, hey, you're going to drop everything else you're doing and you're just going to focus on launch as a service. And if that doesn't work out, goodbye. And I'm like, well, this is a really crazy environment right now. And I don't want to be locked into this one thing. We're creating value in 7 different areas right now. Right. And
meaning
Voyager
no more
that.
hardware, no more QDs.
Exactly. They're no more hardware, no more QDs, launch as a service, do or die. No more, don't consult, tell all your friends to stop calling. I'm like, well, that doesn't seem smart. And so we learned so much. Yeah. So we ended up turning that down. And I love the group that we were talking to about that too. It was a hard decision. The other one we were looking at was Indie VC. We ended up not going that route. Really love those guys, and Bryce is super cool. But we ended up not going that route. And we chose this Voyager route because I think they get it. They're hey, we're trying to band together all these different companies, cross-pollinate ideas, and build something bigger and better, right? And so they have all these different pieces they're trying to plug together. And to me, it's okay, well, this is a new market. This is a new opportunity, and nobody knows exactly how it's actually going to shake. And so if we can all band together and work together to accelerate this, then that makes the most sense to me. And so, yeah, we're doing a majority buyout, give them controlling interest, and then I hold the rest, and we're just going to keep growing this thing. And it's crazy what's on the pipeline for that already through them.
Are there a community of other founders under Voyager that you'll be kind of interfacing with?
Yeah, so they purchased Pioneer, which is run by Robert Zubrin. He did some of the first Mars talks with Elon. That's where a lot of that architecture and idea came from. So he's a cool cat, been around a long time. They purchased a friend of ours called Altia Space Systems, and then we were the third. Well, we were going to be the third, and they snuck in a deal they'd been working on for a super long time, which is NanoRacks, which is, probably not known to people outside the industry, but NanoRacks is huge. They have the only commercial airlock on the space station. So if you want to do science on the space station, we have a direct path to that now, right? We can be hey, we want to use the Bishop airlock. And they're okay. It's really, really cool. And so we're talking about post-COVID, how we can get founders together and kind of build a little bit of a cohort there.
This is the rebundling of the unbundling of the verticalization you're talking about.
Pretty much, yeah. But what's cool about this rebundling is it's horizontal rather than vertical, right? Like we've got like Altius is going to build on space servicing solutions, and we're helping solve launch and nanoracks. Like when I was in college, nanoracks was kind of like getting going, and they like helped pioneer the CubeSat that is so prevalent today and the launcher for CubeSat. So like they're kind of the granddaddies in there. And so yeah, it's kind of a rebundling, but in this case, like a horizontal one where we can all figure out how to make value.
When I think about the space industry, I think about Houston, we have a problem. Like I think about Houston, and then I think about Florida, Cape Canaveral, I believe. And you've mentioned a couple launch sites. You mentioned Louisiana. You're in Alaska. Is there a hub of like where all of this space stuff is happening?
Yeah. So LA is a huge hub for headquarters. Almost all of our clients are based in LA. Seattle has a strong spacecraft, and obviously Blue Origin's in that area, but has a strong spacecraft presence. So a lot of satellites and spacecraft are built there. But then, yeah, you talk about launch sites; those tend to be on coasts, so you can get out over the ocean. So that's Florida, and then Vandenberg's on the west coast. And people don't realize it, but actually, Alaska has the only actual operational commercial launch port in the country, and it's on Kodiak, and that's where Astro launches from. It's where the DARPA Launch Challenge went off of. There's a bunch more companies, kind of considering that right now, and that's great for us because it's right in our backyard.
What's it been like building this company in Alaska?
It's been wild. It's really great because like I'm from here, and so I told my friends like, hey, I'm gonna do this thing, and they're like, okay, and like so humbling, so good. They literally could not care less, could barely be bothered to look up from the Xbox controller, right? And versus like you can pretty much make a living in SF in LA, like going to mixers and telling people what you're gonna do and drinking cheap wine, right? Like ride that hype cycle. And so it was really great. Like there was just days when I woke up, I was like, oh yeah, like I have to actually do it. I can't just like ride the endorphins. I got to go. And so I think it's been really good for that. There's like a super tight knit cadre of people here kind of based both within the university and then within this place called the Boardroom, which Jay's been to. It's the co-working space here of people trying to like help build the economy. We've got a resource extraction economy here. It's not sustainable in any sense of the word. And so my personal passion and interest is like building community here to figure out like what's next for Alaska. Like, what are we going to do? It's such a cool place, really geographically interesting from an Arctic point of view. And yeah, I just love working on those problems. So launch company's been really good. I think ultimately or early on, there was some traction of like, or issues of like, well, how are you going to get out to the launch pad? I'm like, well, probably take an airplane. I can be there in the morning. And okay. And people started to get it. But frankly, COVID like stopped all of that. And we've just been able to like deliver.
When I was up there visiting you, what has it been, like actual years now?
Oh yeah, it's been a
year and a half.
I think it was like 2018, dude.
Someone was explaining to me how it was actually cheaper to fly into Alaska from other states than to try to fly from like Anchorage to Juneau. And those types of questions about costs and things, you're talking about sustainability, like that came up a lot in our conversations and it just kind of blew my mind. Usually when we have founders on the show, we're talking about like their city. We talk about Columbus as opposed to Ohio. You're talking Alaska very broadly, which is like a huge state. What is the ecosystem like in Alaska? Are there different ecosystems within different cities, or is it kind of statewide at this point?
I think right now it's statewide. Fairbanks has University of Alaska Fairbanks, and that's a really great research institution. I went there. There's a space grant program there. There's actually a suborbital launch pad there that people come from all over the world to like launch from the suborbital pad. So there's a lot of cool stuff. We launched a rocket. We flew on the Vomit Comet, all from programs out of UAF. And so I think there's like a dope little cohort developing there. And then there's one in Anchorage, but we recognize the need to be inclusive of like more rural areas, because a lot of what we talk about for the next generation of Alaska is like being fully inclusive across the state and not just having wealth concentrated in like these hubs. And so we're trying to figure out like, what does the future of work look like for people who may want to work seasonally, may not have the best access to internet, though maybe Starlink changes that, and work some of those problems and work some of those issues. And that to me is like the next level of like sticky problem, but where there's like a huge payoff. Like instead of like, oh, well, we made some money and we put some aluminum in space, which is cool. Don't get me wrong. It's like, hey, we transformed like an entire economy and gave people opportunity to live where they want to live and do the work that's meaningful to them, whatever that may be. And that's like, yeah, that's a cool problem for me.
Besides space, what other exciting industries are kind of up and coming in Alaska? like in the software space, in the tech space, in the kind of new emerging businesses space?
Yeah, I've spent most of the quarantine I spent just digging into like, say, Founder Summit, which is like through Earnest Capital. Really love those cats over there. And I'm trying to help push post-COVID, like low code, no code, and growing small SaaS and micro SaaS from Alaska. Because you have to figure out like geographically, how do you either use it as an advantage or how do you decouple it entirely? Using it as an advantage, we have more coastline than like the rest of the United States combined. And so I really think that oceans are an insane future here. And we've got a couple of specific accelerators popping up around ocean opportunity and figuring out how to feed the world and how to like, do all these other really cool things with power generation and transport and cold chain and logistics. And so I think those are the big things. Of course, tourism is always big here, which is cool. But I'm hopeful that as tourism returns, we can build a plan to have knowledge workers who can be anywhere be like, well, wait, I can like literally be in the mountains in 20 minutes. Like I live 90 seconds from the ocean, like holy smokes, there's so much cool stuff going on here and I can be a part of it. And I can also jump a plane from Anchorage in the summer and fly over the North Pole to Germany or, fly around the Arctic Circle to Germany, whatever the geography is, and be there faster than if I went from a lot of other places in lower 48. Like you can be into Europe quickly. So there's a lot of cool stuff that we're building towards, but right now we're watching oil decline and we're trying to figure out where we're going to slot in there to make it all make sense.
What about the funding landscape in Alaska? Did you have an opportunity to raise funding for the launch company in Alaska?
We did. We had a number of opportunities. There's a lot of the behind the scenes work has been building those different tiers, grabbing university students, giving them little stipends, giving them money to like get going, build that cohort up organically. But on the high end, there's also the McKinley Capital Management is running a $100 million Nanook fund out of the state of Alaska that is looking, they're writing like minimum, few $1 million checks, upwards of, quite a large check size. And they're super well tied in with a cohort of other investors to do follow on. Their thesis is like, hey, we'll do anything, but it has to benefit Alaska or be an Alaska-based company. And that's really cool. That's money that came from our sovereign wealth fund, the permanent fund dividend. And so, yeah, we're seeing that start to move and start to happen. They were who we were kind of chatting with about doing a potential VC round, and we love them and we'll support them in the future. But I think that they're doing a lot of cool stuff. So there's all sorts of landscape for money.
This has been awesome, Ben. Congrats on the acquisition. I hope you take it to the moon. If you want people to learn more about the launch company after this, or if people want to learn more about the launch company after this, where should they go?
Thanks, Jay. Yeah, we have a website that may shock you. You can go to www.launch-company.com, read all about what we do. I am unfortunately super active on Twitter at NorthRoadBen, and Launch Company's on Twitter as well. So yeah, shoot us a note, say hi.
Eric, do you know what my favorite part about podcast advertisements is?
That people actually listen to them?
Wow, you read my mind. It's almost like we've done this twice now. Yes, that people actually listen to them. Look, you're listening right now, dear listener.
And me. I'm listening too. I'm listening to you, Jay, here on the Upside Podcast.
And if you have a message that you want to share with the Upside audience, people who care about startups, investing, the middle of the country, this is a really great place to put that message.
Because people will listen to it. And if you have an event or you just want to get something out about your brand, you're hiring, this is the perfect place for the upside.fm/classifieds. That's our classified ad that can run on 1 to 5 podcast episodes.
That's right. Typically, we lock in sponsors for longer sponsorships, but we wanted to make this accessible to you and your message. If you have a message to share with our audience, go to upside.fm/classifieds and get your ad on the airwaves. All right, Eric, we just spoke with Ben Kellie, the founder and CEO of The Launch Company. Where do you want to blast off into for this debrief? That didn't quite work, did it?
It's really more like a touchdown, Jay. I know you're not up on your space puns, but this is definitely more of a touchdown segment here.
You're right. Let's hope we touch down gracefully and don't explode our podcast landing barge.
I don't want to explode any part of this podcast. And landing barge, I didn't even know we had that.
That's what we're sitting on right now.
I want to start with the general space industry. I feel like I almost apologized to Ben after we got off the air because I asked so many questions about the industry specifically that we didn't dig that much into all of the nitty gritty of the launch company.
Yeah, totally. I mean, space is a new frontier for us, potentially the final frontier for humans. I don't know. Are we still calling space the final frontier, or is it just the next frontier?
I have to imagine that once you get to space, there's like a new final frontier. Like we'll find something new and they'll be like, oh yeah, shit. Of course that's the final frontier.
But even that's got to be like within space, right? Maybe like time travel would be a new frontier, but even that's like an existing frontier just in the past. I feel like space is still the final frontier.
I mean, that seems like a very myopic view in the grand scheme of things.
But you're right. We didn't know much about the space, so we spent some time digging into the space, and I enjoyed that. And I'm not going to apologize, but you're right. We didn't get into all the numbers and all the fun stuff with the launch company that we could have. However, I have the benefit of having worked with Ben for a couple years now, and so I know a little bit more of that stuff than I typically know about a guest coming in. And I feel like we still got a pretty full look at least how the company operates, what they're building, and now into the next phase of their business, mid-acquisition with Voyager. Seems like a pretty exciting time for the launch company.
I have something that's been changing for me from a like thought perspective for the last probably 2 years. When we had Jared on from Muxy, they were doing a lot of consulting on the side and consulting style revenues. And we're like, it doesn't feel like they have the right product yet. And they're going out and they're helping with this and they're helping with that. And that's not a scalable, venture backable, hey, we're going to take this thing on a rocket ship. But I think it's actually like maybe one of the best ways to start a business because you get to learn firsthand what all of your customers are looking for, what they need, and you're doing, the proverbial do things that don't scale. So I think when we're talking to Ben and they started as a pure consulting company, now they're making products because that was a need and they're doing this because that was a need and they're doing this because that was a need. It's like one of those things, maybe it is launch as a service, is going to just absolutely take off because it's starting with a customer-centric view.
Take off. Good use of wordplay there. Yeah, I think this is starting to land for me as well. Could be really good customer development and kind of feedback loops. There's of course the caveat of, well, the consulting probably needs to be related to something cutting edge that will inform further product decisions and not just like for a pure revenue basis, at least if you're looking at this from a venture scalable model. But I mean, we see this all the time. I see this with digital creators where it's like the services are the economic engine that give me the time and space to build the products. And I think that works for anybody developing any type of product. But you get to the question of, if I'm a venture capitalist and this is one of the 10, 20 bets I'm going to take this year, and I want to put money into it, I understand that they may be wary of that type of time going into services-based revenue.
It feels like this isn't a moonshot investment. It's more of like sorry, I just laughed at my own pun there. It's more of like hey, people want to go to space. It's becoming more and more, there's more and more capital down here that's funding the ability to go to space, whether it is the moon or just getting into orbit or Mars or whatever. So what is the next step to that? You need to be able to launch off of this planet to get to where you want to go. This feels like, what is it? Selling the picks and shovels in San Francisco, selling the Levi's jeans in San Francisco and not going for gold.
When are we going to change the terminology from moonshot to Mars shot? Because Mars shot is a fundamentally harder shot to take, right? We've already reached the moon. We just reached Mars for the first time.
Maybe we just throw it in there as like the Andromeda shot. So that way it stays relevant for a while. I don't want to get to Mars and then it's like, all right, well now Jupiter. And then we got to keep on adding and adding. Let's just go Andromeda. Let's say something really far away. So it stays in the lexicon.
Every time I've talked to Ben about this, it just seems so inaccessible to me. Like all these topics just like blow my mind. And it's hard for me to understand exactly what he's going through and building this. It sounds super crazy. But then at the same time, when you listen to him talk, it doesn't sound that much crazier than anyone else we have on here talking about the buyer of their product. It just seems smaller as far as like the number of players involved and higher cost and probably higher stakes too. But it's kind of normalized for him. Like he has the same pieces of the value chain fundamentally. They're just different parties.
That was my question to him about, does this ever feel daunting? I think he was mentioning that like he was on a call with NASA or someone. I'm like, most entrepreneurs and founders are selling to like other small and medium-sized businesses to start. They're not calling up Russian rocket scientists. It's like a very different type of business to start. And I think stakes is definitely a fair way to think about that.
But also when he talks about like his connections and relationships that he built in the SpaceX days, when these big problems come up, they literally just call him on the phone. Like they're not scheduling some like large scale conference call or like in-person meeting for months out. Like, hey, we have a problem. we're going to call you because you're an engineer that we trust to help solve this problem. Can you come make this happen? To me, I like that. That feels like a very natural, just kind of sales and problem solving type of space. And you mentioned that some of the older school players are slower to welcome newer entrants into the marketplace. But I kind of like that experience of people just calling you up and saying, hey, we're about to launch this rocket. Can you come build the launch site?
Feels like he's definitely in an inner circle here. How do you think about like funding something like this? Because it doesn't really feel like a venture style, as we kind of alluded to already, a venture style business, but it doesn't really, where do you go with something like this?
Yeah, I don't know. This is where we could have gotten more insight in terms of the number of customers, I think, because it sounds like on a transaction basis, big opportunity for both the QDs and to be using the launch site. But how many people can do that in a calendar year? How many people are trying to do that in a calendar year? Because there is still a fundamental limit. If you're building a multi-use launch site, cool. It's going to be located in one place, which, if I'm launching a rocket, I probably need to build that rocket fairly close by. I don't know if I'm going to truck the rocket across the country to use that. And I don't know how many people are just doing that. But you have 52 weeks out of the year. How many days a year are you launching rockets out of that site? So these are kind of like unit economics that I didn't get a lot of insight in to talk about. So I'd be curious to know more about how many customers are launching every year, and also how many customers might be buying things like the QDs, and what other hardware is in development right now that might be able to augment that.
So it looks like that there's around 100 to 200 total players in the space. We're looking at a breakdown of manufacturers of space vehicles, propulsion manufacturers, satellite manufacturers. And within that first manufacturer bucket, there's cargo transport vehicles, crew transport vehicles, launch vehicle manufacturers, landers, rovers, and orbiters, and then research craft and tech demonstrators. So it seems like there's a lot of different types of customers as well. It's not just, hey, we're a vertically integrated SpaceX or Blue Origin or Virgin, and we need you to do this thing. But it's maybe we only make the orbiters or the landers or the rovers, and we still need your help with this piece because we need to understand how it fits through launch. I think to your point, it's kind of which of those customer segments are they most involved with, and where's the opportunity to grow it? Or is it just kind of a smattering of who reaches out?
It makes me think back to our conversation with Eric of Plus One Robotics, where he was talking about there are really only a handful of like big players here that we really want to work with. And so if you're going to think about funding this, you're kind of taking a bet that this is a service that a few big players are going to need, and this is the company that's going to win out in providing that service. And I could see that, given that there's probably easily like one hand the number of people that have the experience that Ben has in building these launch sites. So if you believe that is going to take off, to use the word that we keep throwing around here, it seems like the right founder to back.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That gets us to the founder specifically, where we usually start here. But I think you and I both have just about zero reservations on Ben as a founder.
Yeah, I'm biased personally. I've visited Ben in Alaska and it was amazing. But the dude just works really hard and he's very humble and he's smart as hell. I mean, if you can build a launch pad that a rocket can take off from and land on again in the middle of the ocean, pretty smart dude.
It seems like space is really heating up in terms of the amount of capital that's being poured into it recently. We're getting more and more of these kind of satellite manufacturers getting funded. We're seeing a few venture capital style funds targeting specifically space companies. I think Techstars launched a space accelerator. So I'm going to transition here into what I want to see in the next 6 to 18 months. And that is a continuation of the number of players in the space industry growing, because it's going to make Ben and the launch company more of an established force the more people join the space or spin out of SpaceX and remember, hey, launch company, that's who we should use, or spin out of Blue Origin or spin out of Virgin. So it's just thinking through more of how much capital is flowing into space and how is that converting into more people doing more things in space, because that's going to lend itself to more launches, to better unit economics, and to less of that consolidated thing, that consolidated situation that you mentioned with Eric. If there's only going to be 3 players, It's a nice business, but it's not, I don't think it's as robust.
That's a fun outlook. I'm looking for proliferation or expansion into the hardware product line, what that looks like, because I think that could be really great business as things proliferate. Even if, your launch site is in the Pacific Northwest, if there are pieces of hardware that you can develop to give to other launch sites in different parts of the country, maybe that's a profitable thing. I don't really know. To be honest, this whole space is still like pretty elusive to me and pretty inaccessible, but it seems like they have a couple paths forward and they're mid-acquisition right now. So if you would have funded this, maybe you'd be having a nice little exit right now.
J blank space Klaus. There you go.
I've got a blank space, baby, and I'll write your name. If you have any thoughts on this episode, or if you have other founders in the space that we should talk to, we'd love to hear from you. You can tweet at us at UpsideFM or email us hello@upside.fm. Eric, what else? What other calls to action can we give our audience right now?
If you're listening to this and you're in Alaska and you say, hey, we should talk to more Alaska companies, or I want to launch a podcast that does exactly what Upside does, but in Alaska, reach out to us.
That's all for this week. Thanks for listening. We'd love to hear what you think about this episode, so tweet at us at UpsideFM or email us hello@upside.fm and let us know. You can learn more about us and browse our entire back catalog of episodes at upside.fm. And if you love our show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts. That goes a long way in helping us bring high-quality guests to the show.
Rocky and Sylvester. One for underrated, two for underpaid. Today I'm gonna